Ethan had always liked quiet places. He wasn't the kind of man who needed noise or crowds to feel alive. For years, he dreamed of finding a piece of land far enough from the city to breathe, but close enough that he could drive into town when he needed to. When he finally found the small property sitting on the edge of a newly planned neighborhood, he thought it was perfect. The land stretched wide and open, with oak trees that leaned gently toward a gravel road. The road curved up from the main highway, ran through his property, and disappeared toward the land behind him. The real estate agent mentioned that a new development would be built there soon, and for a moment Ethan hesitated. But the agent assured him the construction company had made an agreement with the previous owner. They would use the gravel road during building, then find another access point when their work was done. That was enough for him. The view was peaceful, the price was fair, and the quiet hum of nature made him feel at home. So he signed the papers, packed his old truck, and moved in. The first few months went by easily. Construction trucks rumbled past his home almost every day, carrying lumber, pipes, and cement. Dust flew up, and sometimes the noise lasted late into the evening, but Ethan didn't complain. He understood they had work to do. The foreman, a man named Carl, had always been polite and waved each morning. They even chatted a few times about fishing spots nearby. By the end of the year, the new neighborhood took shape. Houses lined the hills, lawns were rolled out, and little white fences appeared one by one. The crews finished paving driveways, and the heavy trucks disappeared. Ethan was relieved to finally have peace again. He could sit on his porch, drink his coffee, and enjoy the sound of the wind instead of hammering and saws. Then one morning, he found a white envelope stuck in his mailbox. It had a clean printed label that read, Homeowners Association Notice. Ethan frowned. He had heard of HOAs before. People in town always joked about them being strict, but he didn't live in one. Curious, he tore it open. Inside was a neatly typed letter. It said he had been found in violation of community maintenance standards and had been issued a fine of $250 for failure to maintain property entrance. He read it twice, then laughed softly. There had to be some mistake. The letter mentioned his road, the gravel stretch that ran across his land, and said it failed to meet visual standards of the community. He didn't even live in the community. Ethan decided to call the number listed at the bottom of the letter. After a few rings, a woman answered, her voice crisp and businesslike. Homeowners Association office, this is Linda speaking. Hi, Linda, Ethan said, keeping his tone friendly. I think I got one of your letters by mistake. My name's Ethan. I live at the property right before your neighborhood. The road you mentioned is mine. I'm not part of the HOA. There was a short pause. Then Linda said, Oh, Mr. Ethan, your property borders our community, correct? Yes, he replied. That gravel road that leads up to your gates is part of my land. Always has been. Well, she said, her voice firm, that road is used by our residents daily, so it needs to meet our appearance standards. You'll need to resurface it or we'll have to continue issuing violations. Ethan blinked, unsure he'd heard right. Ma'am, that road doesn't belong to the HOA, it's private. I can send you a copy of the deed. I'm afraid that's not how it works, Linda interrupted. Since the road connects directly to the community entrance, it affects our overall value. Our regulations cover shared access points. He tried not to sound annoyed, but it's not shared. The developer only had temporary permission during construction. There's no legal agreement giving you access. Her tone tightened. You'll have to take that up with our legal department then. But as of now, the fine stands. The call ended shortly after. Ethan sat there for a while, shaking his head. He thought it would blow over once they realized the mistake. But a week later, another letter arrived. This time the fine had doubled. He decided to take a drive through the new neighborhood to talk to someone in person. As he drove past the white fence and newly planted trees, he noticed how neat everything was. Fresh paint, identical mailboxes, trimmed bushes, everything looked controlled. At the center of it all was a small office by the gate, with a gold sign that read Community Management. Inside, he found Linda sitting behind a glass-topped desk, tapping away on a laptop. She looked up and smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Ethan, right? She said. What brings you in today? He placed both letters on her desk. I just want to clear this up. I own the road. It's private property. You can't fine me for something that isn't yours. Linda glanced at the papers but didn't pick them up. I understand your concern, but our residents use that road daily. It's part of our access, which makes it part of our jurisdiction. That's not how ownership works, he said quietly. You can't take control just because you use something. She smiled again, tighter this time. We'll see what our lawyer says. Ethan left before he said something he'd regret. He drove home, made himself a cup of coffee, and decided to wait it out. Surely someone with sense would realize the mistake soon. But a month later, a third letter arrived. Then a fourth. Each one added new charges. Failure to maintain shared property, unauthorized signage, and roadway negligence. The total amount due was now over $2,000. He called again, but this time no one answered. He emailed, no reply. Weeks went by, and the tone of the letters grew more threatening. They mentioned possible legal action and property liens. Ethan couldn't believe it. One afternoon, while he was outside fixing his mailbox, a shiny black SUV pulled up. A man in a suit stepped out holding a clipboard. Afternoon, the man said politely. I'm here from the Homeowners Association to perform a property inspection. Ethan set down his wrench. Inspection? For what? Routine review, the man said, looking down at his paper. We received several complaints about the state of the road leading into the community. That road isn't part of your community, Ethan said, trying to stay calm. You're standing on private property. The man looked uncomfortable. Sir, I'm just following orders. Then your orders are wrong, Ethan replied. You can leave now. The man hesitated, then nodded and walked back to his car. Ethan watched as the SUV disappeared behind the curve, a mix of anger and disbelief building inside him. That night, he pulled out the folder that held all his land documents. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, a detailed map and deed record from the county. The gravel road from start to finish was outlined clearly under his name. There was no mention of any easement or shared right-of-way. He made copies of everything and sent them to the HOA's address with a short letter explaining that all future contact should stop, unless they could prove otherwise. He mailed it and kept the receipt. For a few weeks, things went quiet. No letters, no calls. He started to relax again, thinking maybe they had finally realized their mistake. Then one morning, as he was heading out to his truck, he saw something that made his stomach tighten. A landscaping crew was working along the side of his road. They had parked their truck halfway up the path and were spreading gravel, trimming grass, and putting up little reflective markers. Ethan walked over and waved for the foreman to stop. Hey, who sent you guys? He asked. The foreman looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. Koi, sir. Said we're cleaning up the entrance. Ethan took a deep breath. You're on private land. You can't do that here, the man looked unsure. We just got paid to do this section. Then you'll have to take it up with them, Ethan said firmly. You're trespassing right now. After a few tense seconds, the crew packed up and left. Ethan stood there staring at the fresh line of gravel they had dumped, his patience wearing thin. That night, another letter arrived. This time it accused him of obstructing community maintenance efforts and added another $1,000 fine. He almost laughed, it was so absurd. But deep down it wasn't funny anymore. It was harassment. He sat down at his kitchen table staring at the growing stack of letters. They were trying to pressure him into submission, hoping he'd just give in and pay. But he wasn't that kind of man. He knew one thing for sure. The HOA might think they ran the neighborhood, but they didn't realize something crucial. Without that road, none of their residents could reach their fancy homes. Ethan leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time in weeks. They wanted to play this game? Fine. But they were about to learn exactly who controlled the only way in or out. Ethan didn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about all those letters piling up on his kitchen table. He wasn't scared of the HOA anymore, just tired. Tired of their arrogance. Tired of being treated like he was some kind of troublemaker for owning what was his. The next morning, he sat on his porch with his coffee and stared down the road that caused all the chaos. The sunlight touched the gravel and made it sparkle faintly. It was peaceful again, just the way he liked it. But he knew peace wouldn't last long. He decided it was time to get some legal advice. A friend from town gave him the number of a local attorney named Mr. Grayson, a quiet man with a small office near the courthouse. Ethan called and set an appointment for the next day. When he arrived, the office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Books lined the walls, and a small desk fan hummed in the corner. Mr. Grayson was polite, calm, and had the kind of face that didn't show much emotion. "So," he said after listening to Ethan's story, "you're telling me they're fining you for a road that you own?" "Exactly," Ethan replied. "They keep sending letters, and now they've even sent people to fix my property without asking." Mr. Grayson leaned back in his chair. "Do you have the deed and any paperwork from the original developer?" Ethan pulled out a manila envelope filled with copies of his documents. "Everything's in here." The lawyer spread the papers out across the desk, reading them one by one. He nodded slowly. "Well, there's no recorded easement here. The road starts and ends entirely on your land. That means it's private, no question about it." "That's what I've been trying to tell them," Ethan said. "They won't listen." Mr. Grayson smiled faintly. "They will. But sometimes people like that need a little help understanding. I'll draft a letter to their office explaining the situation in legal terms. That should stop the nonsense." Ethan left the office feeling hopeful for the first time in months. Maybe this would finally put an end to the drama. He spent the afternoon fixing a few things around the house, listening to the quiet hum of the wind through the trees. It almost felt normal again. A week later, the lawyer called him. "They got my letter," Mr. Grayson said, "but their response was unusual. They're claiming that your road is a shared community access road and falls under their authority." Ethan frowned. "Can they even say that?" "They can say it," Grayson said, "but proving it is another matter. They have no recorded easement, no official rights. They're bluffing." "So what do I do?" Ethan asked. "Nothing for now," the lawyer replied. "Keep every letter they send. Don't argue with them anymore. Let them keep digging their own hole," and that's what Ethan did. Every time a new envelope appeared, he opened it, read it, and carefully filed it away. He didn't reply. He didn't call. He just waited. By mid-spring, the fines had reached over $20,000. The letters grew harsher, accusing him of ongoing non-compliance and refusal to maintain community standards. The HOA even sent one that said they would pursue legal remedies if he didn't pay. Ethan showed all of it to Mr. Grayson. The lawyer chuckled softly. "They're threatening to sue you for not following rules that don't apply to you. This will be fun." But the HOA wasn't done yet. A few weeks later, Ethan came home from running errands and found 2 trucks parked near the end of his road. Men in neon vests were spreading fresh gravel and cutting weeds again. He sighed, parked his truck, and walked up to them. "Afternoon," he called out. "Who told you to do this?" One of the men turned. "HOA office," he said. "Said to clean up the entrance." Ethan crossed his arms. "You're on private property. Did they give you permission from the owner?" The man hesitated. They said it was part of the community." "It's not," Ethan said firmly. "You're trespassing. I need you to pack up and leave." The man looked embarrassed but nodded. "Sorry, sir. We'll go." After they left, Ethan took pictures of everything, the trucks, the gravel piles, the tire marks. Then he called his lawyer again. "They were on my property." "Again," he said. Mr. Grayson's voice was calm as ever. "Perfect. That's evidence. Keep it." 2 days later, Ethan received yet another letter. This one was longer, almost 5 pages. It accused him of interfering with community improvement efforts and added another $5,000 fine. The total was now over $70,000. Ethan couldn't help but laugh this time. The number was so ridiculous it didn't even seem real. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and stared at the letter for a long time. That's when an idea began to form in his mind. If they really believed they had power over him, maybe it was time to remind them exactly where that power ended. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted respect, and for them to leave him alone. He spent the next few days doing research, digging through county maps and land records. Everything confirmed what he already knew. The gravel road belonged entirely to him. Not a single legal document gave the HOA any right to use it. One evening, while walking along the road, he noticed how quiet it was. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the gravel. He thought about all the homeowners who drove this road every day without realizing whose land they were crossing. They weren't bad people. Most probably had no idea about the fight going on. It wasn't their fault. But their HOA was using his property like it was their own. and now they were about to learn the truth. The next morning, Ethan drove back to Mr. Grayson's office. The lawyer looked up from his desk as Ethan walked in, holding a fresh stack of papers. "I think it's time," Ethan said simply. Grayson smiled. "Time for what?" "To remind them who owns the road." The lawyer nodded. "Then let's do it properly. We'll start by drafting a formal notice of property rights and a cease and desist letter. You'll deliver it yourself so there's no confusion." They worked on it together for over an hour. The letter was short but clear. It stated that the gravel road was private property belonging solely to Ethan, that there was no recorded easement or community right-of-way, and that any further trespassing or unauthorized work would result in legal action. At the bottom, Mr. Grayson added one more line. "Access to the property will be restricted if violations continue." Ethan smiled as he read it. "I like that part." He delivered the letter himself that afternoon. The HOA office was quiet when he arrived. Linda, the same woman who had once brushed him off, looked up from her desk as he entered. "Mr. Ethan," she said coolly, "what can I do for you?" He placed the letter on her desk. "You can start by reading that." She frowned and picked it up. Her eyes moved quickly across the page and her expression changed from confidence to irritation. "You can't just restrict access to our community," she said sharply. "I can," Ethan replied calmly, "because it's my land. You've been using it without permission for over a year. That ends now." She opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan simply turned and walked out. That evening, he drove down to the hardware store and bought a heavy steel gate, a few sturdy posts, and a new lock. He worked until sunset the next day, setting it up at the entrance where the gravel road met the main highway. When he was done, he stood back and looked at it. It wasn't fancy, just strong, simple, and clear. He hung a small sign on the gate that read "Private Property." No unauthorized access. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. He didn't hate anyone. He just wanted his boundaries respected. The next morning, chaos erupted. Ethan woke to the sound of horns and shouting outside. He walked to the porch and saw a line of cars stopped behind the gate. People were standing around, confused and frustrated. A few were on their phones, likely calling the HOA. Ethan didn't say a word. He just watched from a distance, sipping his coffee. Within an hour, Linda arrived in her SUV, looking furious. She stormed up to the gate and shouted, "You can't do this! You're blocking our residents!" Ethan walked up slowly, calm as ever. "I warned you," he said. "You've been using my land without permission. Until we sort this out legally, no one passes through." She pointed a finger at him. "We'll call the police." "Please do," he said, and they did. 2 patrol cars arrived a short while later. The officers listened to both sides carefully. Then one of them asked Ethan for his property documents. He handed over the copies he always kept in his truck. The officers went through them quietly. After a few minutes, one of them turned to Linda. "Ma'am, this road is indeed private property. He's within his rights to restrict access." Her face turned pale. "That can't be right," she whispered. "I'm afraid it is," the officer said. "You'll need to resolve this through the courts." The crowd of residents began murmuring. Some looked angry, others confused. Ethan didn't blame them. They hadn't known any of this was happening. He kept his tone kind. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, folks, but I've tried for months to settle this peacefully. I didn't want it to come to this." The officers left soon after and Linda drove off in silence. The cars slowly turned around one by one. The road grew quiet again. That night, as the sun went down, Ethan sat on his porch and looked at the new gate standing firm at the entrance. He could already imagine the storm that was about to come from the HOA office. But for the first time, he didn't feel angry or nervous. He felt in control. The HOA had spent months pushing him around, sending letters, making threats, pretending to have power they didn't actually have. But now, the truth was standing right there at the end of his driveway, a metal gate that told the world where his property began and where their authority ended. And as the crickets began to sing in the distance, Ethan smiled to himself. They thought they could fine him into silence. But what they didn't realize was that they had been driving over his land every single day, and now that privilege was gone. For a few days after Ethan put up the gate, things were strangely quiet. He almost couldn't believe it. No more letters, no phone calls, no landscapers showing up uninvited, just peace and silence. He knew it wouldn't last forever, but he enjoyed every bit of it while he could. He woke up early each morning, made his coffee, and sat on the porch like he always did. The new gate glimmered faintly in the sunlight, a reminder that he'd finally taken control of the situation. It felt good to know that for once he wasn't being pushed around. But by the end of the week, the quiet broke. He was out in the yard chopping firewood when he noticed a car parked near the end of the gate. A woman in her 30s stood beside it, looking frustrated. She waved him over when she saw him. "Excuse me, sir," she said as he approached. "Do you know who owns this gate?" "I live in the neighborhood up the hill and I can't get to work." Ethan nodded kindly. "That would be me. The road and this gate are on my property." Her expression softened a little. "Oh, I didn't realize. The HOA said you were blocking the community road." He sighed. "They've been saying a lot of things that aren't true. I tried for months to fix this peacefully, but they left me no choice. This is private land. I'm not stopping anyone out of spite. I'm protecting what's mine." The woman looked conflicted but didn't seem angry. "That makes sense," she said quietly. "They never mentioned any of that. They just said you were being difficult." Ethan smiled sadly. "I'm sure they did. Sorry you're stuck in the middle of it." She nodded, thanked him, and left her car there while she called someone for a ride. Watching her walk away, Ethan felt a mix of pity and frustration. It wasn't the residents' fault. They just didn't know the truth. The HOA had twisted everything. By the next morning, the road was crowded again. Cars lined up near the gate. People were honking, yelling, and calling the HOA office nonstop. Some even knocked on Ethan's door asking what was going on. He stayed calm and explained to each person the same way, that the road was his property and he had only closed it after being harassed and fined without cause. Some believed him. Others didn't, but most of them were simply caught off guard by how messy things had become. Later that day, 2 police cars pulled up again. The same officer from before stepped out, looking slightly tired. "Morning, Mr. Ethan," he said. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." The officer leaned against his car. "The HOA is still claiming this road is part of their community, but I checked again with the county office. You were right, it's fully on your land. They don't have any recorded rights to it." "Glad to hear someone checked," Ethan said with a small grin. The officer smiled back. "Yeah, honestly, they're just making noise now. There's nothing we can do unless a court orders something different. You're in the clear." Ethan thanked him and the officers drove off. That reassurance gave him peace of mind. But he knew the HOA wouldn't stop there. People like that rarely did. 2 days later, a letter came, not from the HOA, but from their lawyers. It was full of legal words and threats, saying they would seek immediate injunction to reopen the road and pursue compensation for damages caused to residents. Ethan took the letter straight to Mr. Grayson's office. The lawyer read through it carefully, then chuckled under his breath. "They really don't learn, do they?" he said. "We'll respond formally, and this time we'll go one step further. We'll file a counterclaim." "Counterclaim?" Ethan asked. "Yep," Grayson said, leaning back in his chair, "for trespassing, harassment, and property damage. You've got proof, photos, letters, and witnesses. We'll make sure they regret pushing this far." Ethan nodded. He didn't like fighting, but at this point he was done playing nice. The following week, Grayson filed the paperwork. Once word got around, the HOA office turned into chaos. Residents started showing up demanding answers. They'd been paying HOA fees for years, assuming everything was properly managed. And now they learned that the main road they drove on every day wasn't even legally theirs. Ethan started hearing bits and pieces from people in town, how homeowners were furious, how meetings had turned into shouting matches, and how the president of the HOA, Linda, had gone from confident to panicked overnight. Meanwhile, Ethan kept to himself. He didn't want drama. He just wanted justice. But part of him couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction knowing the truth was finally catching up to them. A few days later, there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, he found a man in his 40s standing there holding a small box of cookies. "Hi," the man said awkwardly. "I'm from the neighborhood up the hill. My name's David. I just wanted to apologize for what's been going on." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Apologize? You didn't do anything wrong." "Maybe not," David said, "but our HOA sure did. We all believe their version of the story, that you were just trying to make trouble. But after last week's meeting, it's pretty clear they've been lying to us." Ethan nodded slowly. "I figured the truth would come out eventually. They showed us the paperwork, David continued. You really do own the road. Everyone's angry, especially since our fees were supposed to go toward maintenance on it. Turns out they were paying contractors to fix a road they didn't even have rights to. Ethan smiled faintly. I'm sorry you all got caught in this mess. David sighed. It's not your fault. Honestly, I respect what you did. Most people would have given up by now. He handed Ethan the box. My wife baked these, just consider it a peace offering. Ethan chuckled softly. I appreciate that. As David left, Ethan stood on his porch for a while, watching the sunset. It felt strange. For months he'd been treated like a villain, but now people were finally starting to see the truth. It didn't erase the frustration he'd gone through, but it sure helped ease it. The next week brought more changes. News traveled fast, and soon a local reporter showed up at Ethan's place, asking if he'd be willing to share his side of the story. At first he said no. He didn't want attention. But after thinking it over, he realized it might be the best way to finally set the record straight. So he agreed. The news story aired 2 days later under the title Local Man Fined $70,000 by HOA, but the road was his. It spread quickly online. Comments poured in, most of them siding with Ethan and criticizing the HOA for their arrogance. That's when things really started to unravel for the HOA board. Members began resigning one by one. The community held an emergency meeting where residents demanded transparency. They wanted to know where their money had gone, who had approved the legal threats, and how they could have been misled for so long. Ethan stayed out of it. But word got back to him that Linda had been voted out as HOA president. She'd apparently broken down during the meeting, blaming the lawyers, the former developer, and even her own board. A week later, another letter arrived, this one different from the rest. It wasn't on fancy letterhead or filled with legal jargon. It was handwritten. Mr. Ethan, it began, I want to personally apologize for how we treated you. We made a mistake. You were right from the beginning and we were wrong to ignore you. I no longer represent the HOA, but I wanted you to know that we're sorry. It was signed simply. Linda. Ethan read it twice and then set it down on the table. He didn't feel angry anymore, just relieved. It had taken months of patience and headaches, but finally things were settling. Still, he knew there was one last step to take. The lawsuit was still active and he wasn't going to drop it until everything was officially resolved. Mr. Grayson told him they were close to a settlement. The HOA had agreed to pay his legal fees and compensation for the damage they'd caused. When the final papers were signed, Ethan felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The road, the land, everything was finally his again. No more arguments, no more threats. After all the drama, he decided to make one last improvement. He hired a local company to pave the road properly and put up a clean sign at the entrance that read, Private property, authorized access only. When it was done, he stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the workers finish. The road gleamed under the afternoon sun, smoother and stronger than ever before. As the last truck drove away, Ethan smiled. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect, something the HOA had taken for granted from the start. Now, every time someone drove by, they saw the sign and the gate and knew exactly where the line was drawn. No more confusion. No more bullying. Just quiet. That evening, David stopped by again. Looks good, he said, nodding toward the road. Thanks, Ethan replied. Hopefully it stays this way. It will, David said. The new HOA board wants to make things right. They're planning to meet with you soon to discuss a proper agreement for road access. This time legally. Ethan nodded. Good. That's all I ever wanted. After David left, Ethan sat on his porch sipping his coffee as the sun dipped below the trees. The air was still, the road empty. He thought back to everything that had happened, the letters, the threats, the endless frustration, and how it had all led to this moment of peace. It hadn't been easy. But through it all, he'd learned something important. Standing your ground doesn't always mean fighting back loud. Sometimes it just means staying calm, being patient, and letting the truth do the work for you. He smiled softly, took another sip and looked down the quiet, well-paved road, the same one that had once caused so much trouble. Now it was more than just a road. It was proof that sometimes the simplest man can outlast the loudest crowd. And for the first time in a long time, everything finally felt right again. After months of struggle, peace had finally returned to Ethan's property. The road was fixed, the lawsuit settled, and the chaos from the HOA had faded into distant noise. Life had a new kind of quiet, one that felt earned, not accidental. He'd gotten used to that silence. Mornings were calm again. He'd brew his coffee, sit on the porch, and watch the sunlight creep through. The trees. The world seemed slower now. For the first time in years, he didn't have to look over his shoulder or check his mailbox with dread. But even peace has its ripples. About 2 months after the settlement, Ethan received a letter, not from the old HOA board, but from the newly elected one. The envelope was plain and friendly. No lawyer logos or bold threats this time. Inside was a short, polite letter explaining that the new board wanted to rebuild trust with the community and hoped he'd be open to a proper discussion about road access. He sat back in his chair, reading it twice. It was respectful, well-written, and for once didn't try to push him around. He smiled. Finally, he muttered to himself. People who understand manners. A week later, 3 representatives from the new HOA came by, 2 men and 1 woman. They parked respectfully near the gate and waited until Ethan walked over. The woman introduced herself as Claire, the new president. "Mr. Ethan," she said with a genuine smile. "Thank you for meeting us. We know the past board caused a lot of problems, and we're truly sorry for that. We just want to start fresh." Ethan nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, Claire. I can't say it was pleasant dealing with the old board, but I respect that you're trying to do things right." She explained that many of the homeowners were embarrassed about how things had been handled. The previous leadership had used fear and misinformation, and most people had no idea how much trouble they'd caused him. "We've decided to dissolve some of the old policies," she said, "and we want to set up a legal easement for the road with fair compensation. That way residents can still use it, but you'll be properly recognized as the landowner." Ethan thought about it for a moment. He wasn't greedy. He didn't care about money. What mattered to him was respect. "As long as it's done the right way," he said, "I'm open to that." They talked for nearly an hour, not as enemies, but as neighbors. It was calm, honest, and productive, a complete contrast to how things used to be. Before leaving, Claire handed him a folder with draft agreements and thanked him for being patient. That evening, Ethan called his lawyer, Mr. Grayson, to review the documents. Grayson read through everything and said, "This is the first time they've done something right. The terms look fair, and they're offering a monthly maintenance payment that's actually reasonable." Ethan smiled. Guess miracles do happen. Within a month, the new agreement was signed. The HOA now had legal, limited access to the road, and Ethan was officially recognized as its owner. Both sides were satisfied. Word spread quickly around town. People who once whispered about him now waved when they saw him. He'd gone from being the troublemaker to the quiet man who stood his ground and won, but Ethan wasn't one to gloat. He didn't care about being right in the public eye. He cared about fairness. And now that fairness had finally been restored, he could focus on something else entirely. Living. He started fixing up the rest of his property. The old barn got a new coat of paint. The garden, which had been neglected during the chaos, was blooming again. Birds had returned, and sometimes he'd find rabbits hopping near the fence line. Life had color again. Every so often, a few neighbors would stop by, people who used to avoid him. They'd bring cookies, tools, or just conversation. The tension that once filled the air had lifted. One afternoon, Claire stopped by again. She stood by the gate smiling as Ethan approached. "Mind if I walk with you for a bit?" she asked. "Not at all," Ethan said, opening the gate. They walked along the newly paved road, the sound of gravel crunching beneath their shoes. She thanked him for his patience again, and he told her how much he appreciated the new direction the neighborhood was taking. "You know," she said after a moment, "when we first took over, the files were a mess. We found old letters the previous board never sent and others that they forged. They really tried to make you look like a villain." Ethan shook his head. "Doesn't surprise me. They wanted control and I was in their way." Claire sighed. "Well, you taught everyone a valuable lesson that power doesn't mean ownership. And honestly, the neighborhood's better now because of it." He smiled softly. "I didn't set out to teach anyone anything. I just wanted peace." They walked a little further in silence. When they reached the edge of the property, Claire looked at the sign by the road. the one that said private property, authorized access only. "Guess that's your reminder of what you went through," she said gently. Ethan chuckled. "More like a reminder to never let people push you around again." She nodded and, after a brief chat, headed back. Ethan watched her leave, feeling oddly proud. Not for himself, but for how things had finally changed for the better. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, he thought about how far things had come. He remembered the first letter, the endless fines, the threats, the shouting, all the noise that used to fill his days. And now, here he was, surrounded by calm. But peace doesn't erase memory. There were still moments when he'd find himself replaying it all, not with anger, but with disbelief at how absurd it had gotten. A $70,000 fine, all because someone thought they could bully him. He shook his head and laughed quietly. "They really picked the wrong guy," he murmured. Months passed. Seasons changed. The trees along the road turned golden, then bare, then green again. The road became part of daily life for the community, but now with mutual respect. Whenever residents used it, they'd wave at Ethan's property or stop by with thanks. It felt good. Not because he needed their approval, but because he finally felt seen as a person, not a problem. One day, Claire invited him to a community barbecue. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't much for crowds, but she insisted, saying everyone wanted him there. So he went. When he arrived, the atmosphere was light and friendly. People greeted him warmly. Kids ran around playing. Music played softly in the background, and the smell of grilled food filled the air. A man from the neighborhood raised a cup and said, "To Ethan, the guy who reminded us that fairness still matters." The crowd laughed and clapped, and Ethan couldn't help but smile. As the day went on, people came up to him to share their own stories, times they'd been pushed around or silenced by the old HOA. Some thanked him for standing up, saying it gave them courage to speak up too. By sunset, he realized something important. His fight hadn't just been about a road. It had been about setting things right, not just for himself, but for everyone who came after. When he got home that evening, he felt lighter. The bitterness that once clung to him was gone. He walked down the road, now lined with flowers the residents had planted as a gesture of appreciation. The air smelled sweet. The world felt full. He reached the gate, looked back at the long stretch of road, and whispered, "It was worth it." As weeks rolled into months, Ethan's story spread beyond the neighborhood. A local magazine picked it up, then a regional paper. Soon, people from other towns started reaching out, sharing similar experiences with overreaching HOAs and unfair treatment. Some even came by to talk with him, to ask advice, to find courage. He never claimed to be an expert, but he always told them the same thing. Don't fight with anger. Fight with facts. Stay calm, stay steady, and don't let fear make you small. It became something of a quiet legacy. People started calling him the man who owned the road, half jokingly, half admiringly. He'd laugh it off, but deep down, he was proud. Not because he'd won against them, but because he hadn't lost himself in the process. By the time the next year rolled around, the HOA was running smoothly, the road was in perfect shape, and the community had grown closer than ever. The conflict that once divided everyone had become a story people told to remind themselves how not to repeat old mistakes. And Ethan? He kept living quietly on his land, just as he'd always wanted. He took care of his garden, fixed up his porch, and sometimes when neighbors walked by, he'd stop to chat and share a laugh. Every time he saw a car drive gently along the road, he felt a small warmth in his chest. Not pride, just peace. He'd been tested, pushed, and nearly broken, but he never bent. And in the end, that made all the difference. That road, once a symbol of conflict, now stood as proof of something much greater. That no matter how small one person seems, standing up for what's right can reshape an entire community. As the sun set one evening, casting a soft orange glow across the pavement, Ethan sat back in his chair with a quiet smile. The road stretched out before him, strong and steady, leading toward the future, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was guarding it. He felt like he was part of it. The fight was long over, but the lesson would stay forever. Peace isn't given. It's earned, one calm step at a time. The following spring arrived brighter than any Ethan could remember. The trees that lined his property were heavy with leaves again, and the road, the same one that once caused him so much trouble, now felt like a part of something peaceful. It wasn't just a path anymore. It was a reminder of everything he had been through and everything he had learned along the way. One sunny morning, Ethan woke early. He walked down the path with a cup of coffee in his hand, breathing in the fresh scent of wet soil after a light rain. The air was crisp, filled with birdsong and the soft hum of life around him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was guarding his land. He simply felt at home. As he reached the end of the road, he saw Claire's car parked by the gate. She stepped out and waved. "Morning, Ethan," she said cheerfully. "Hope I didn't catch you too early." "Not at all," he replied with a smile. "What brings you here today?" She handed him a folder. "We're planning to rename the road officially. We wanted your opinion on the name. After all, it's your land." Ethan raised an eyebrow, flipping through the papers. The suggestion list had names like Oak Trail, Willow Bend, and Harmony Way. But one name caught his eye. Ethan's Crossing. He looked up, slightly surprised. "You're serious about this?" Claire nodded. The board voted. Everyone agreed it's the least we could do after everything you went through. Ethan laughed softly and shook his head. "You don't have to name it after me. I'm just glad things are finally running smoothly." But Claire smiled in that firm, gentle way of hers. Sometimes a name is more than a name. It's a reminder. You stood your ground when no one else could. The least we can do is make sure people remember that. He didn't argue after that. A few weeks later, a new sign was placed at the beginning of the road. Simple black letters on a white background. Ethan's Crossing. At first, it felt strange seeing his name out there for everyone to read. But over time, it grew on him. People began using it in conversation. "Turn left after Ethan's Crossing," or "Meet me near Ethan's Crossing." It became part of the town's small but meaningful map. As the months rolled by, the community grew closer. The new HOA turned out to be fair and respectful. They worked with residents instead of against them. Claire and her team even started a small neighborhood project to create walking trails near the woods. With Ethan's help, he became something of a quiet advisor, not officially, but people often stopped by for his thoughts. When new homeowners moved in, they'd hear about him long before they met him. Some called him the man who taught the HOA a lesson, though he never liked that label. He preferred when people saw him as just Ethan, the man who cared about fairness, not fights. One afternoon, an older couple who had just moved in knocked on his door. They brought a pie as a friendly gesture. The man smiled and said, "We heard about what you did. I just wanted to thank you. Because of you, we felt safe moving here." Ethan didn't quite know what to say. He never thought of his story as something inspiring. He just wanted peace. But hearing how it gave others a sense of security meant more than any award or recognition. As time went on, life settled into a calm rhythm. Ethan spent his days fixing small things around the property, gardening or taking long walks by the stream behind his house. Sometimes he'd host small gatherings, just a few neighbors, coffee and laughter. The once bitter story about lawsuits and fines had become almost like a local legend. People would share it with a smile instead of a frown. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about perseverance. One day, a local reporter came by to do a follow-up piece. The first article about his story had been published months ago, and people wanted to know how things turned out. The reporter, a young man named Ben, set up a small camera near the porch. "So Ethan," he began, "looking back, how do you feel about everything that happened?" Ethan leaned back in his chair and thought for a long moment before answering. "I used to be angry," he admitted. "I felt like the world was unfair, like people could just walk over you if they had more money or louder voices. But I learned something. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning or losing. It's about teaching others to slow down and listen." Ben nodded, scribbling notes. "That's powerful. And what about now? Are you happier?" Ethan smiled. "Happier, yes. Wiser, too. And quieter. Peace has its own sound once you've been through noise." The interview went viral online. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment or standing up for themselves. Ethan's calm, thoughtful words resonated far beyond his little town. But to him, it wasn't about fame. It was just about living honestly. As autumn came again, the community held an event to celebrate the anniversary of the new HOA's formation. 1 year since things changed for the better. They asked Ethan to say a few words. He didn't prepare a speech. He just stood by the microphone under a canopy of golden leaves and spoke from the heart. "I used to think peace came from being left alone," he said, his voice steady. "But I've learned it comes from being understood. When people respect each other, there's no need for fences higher than our hearts." There was a quiet moment, then applause that filled the air. Claire smiled at him from the front row, proud and grateful. That night, after everyone went home, Ethan stood by the new road sign once more. The moonlight made it glow softly, Ethan's Crossing. He traced the letters with his fingers, thinking about everything that name represented. It wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about connection, between him and the people who once saw him as an outsider, between the land and the community, between the fight that began in frustration and the peace that ended it. As the years went on, the story of Ethan's Crossing spread beyond the town. It became a local landmark, not because of its size or beauty, but because of what it symbolized: resilience, fairness, and community. Visitors would sometimes stop by, curious to see the place they'd heard about. Some came from other states, having faced similar issues with their own neighborhood associations. They'd ask Ethan for advice, and he always gave the same simple answer: be patient, be calm, but don't let anyone tell you that respect isn't worth fighting for. He grew older, but his spirit stayed strong. The town often held gatherings by the road, planting flowers and trees as living reminders of how far they had come. When winter came, the snow would rest lightly on the sign, turning it silver in the moonlight. From his window, Ethan would watch cars pass carefully, their headlights glinting on the icy road. He'd smile, knowing that the path was safe, not just because it was maintained, but because it was respected. In time, the HOA even set up a small plaque near the entrance. It read, "Dedicated to the man whose patience taught us fairness and whose road led us to unity." Ethan never asked for it, but when he saw it for the first time, he stood there quietly for a long while. It wasn't pride he felt, and it was peace. The kind that comes when you know your story didn't end in bitterness, but in understanding. Years later, the town would continue to grow. New families moved in, children played by the trees, and life carried on. Many of them never knew the full story of the battle that once defined this place, but every time someone mentioned Ethan's Crossing, there was still a soft tone of respect in their voice. Even when Ethan grew too old to walk the entire road, neighbors would visit him often. They'd bring news, flowers, and laughter. The road that once divided them had become the thing that connected them. One evening, as he sat by his porch watching the sunset, Claire came by one last time. Her hair was streaked with gray now, but her smile hadn't changed. She sat beside him quietly, both of them watching the golden light fade across the horizon. "You know," she said softly, "every time I drive down that road, I think of how different things could have been if you hadn't stood your ground." Ethan nodded slowly. "Sometimes you have to go through storms to see what really matters." They sat there in silence for a while, listening to the evening breeze. The world around them had changed, but some things, respect, peace, and the steady stretch of that road, they stayed constant. When she finally left, Ethan stayed outside for a long time, his eyes fixed on the sign. The night settled softly around him, and he felt an unshakable calm. He didn't fight for recognition, and he didn't chase glory. He simply refused to be treated unfairly, and that small act had rippled farther than he ever imagined. The road had once been a burden, but it became his legacy. It was proof that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and unyielding. And as the stars began to appear above the trees, he smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Peace at last." The story of Ethan's Crossing would live on, not just in signs or plaques, but in the lessons it carried. That even in the smallest corners of the world, one person's courage can turn conflict into connection, and one road can lead an entire community toward understanding.